Oh my god, how often does your boyfriend talk about the Roman Empire? Shut up. How often does your boyfriend think about Xenoclash? Answer? Not enough. If you're epic and cool and awesome, you might remember a little while ago when I covered the series of games titled Xenoclash. It was one of the most unique and fun games I've ever talked about on the channel. Everything in the game applied to me on some level. The gameplay, visual design, the world building and lore, the character with 4 tits. It was a near perfect game in my opinion. And while I didn't feel as strongly about Xenoclash 2, it still added elements to the world and gameplay that I thoroughly enjoyed. At the end of my video, I mentioned the franchise's new edition that had only been released last year. I said I'd take a look at it, and after a whole bunch of other BS happened, I was finally able to sit down and dive into Clash Artifacts of Chaos. And after finishing the game, I feel a slight sense of regret. Regret that I didn't cover Clash sooner, because man, this game slaps. The Clash franchise is developed by Ace Team, a Chilean-based studio that I'd comfortably say is a AA developer. RIP to the former Chilean president Sebastian Pinera. I know you would have loved to see Drake wiggle his meat around on TikTok. The original Clash games are still some really fun experiences, but playing them now, you can definitely feel their age, which is why Clash coming back now is perfect. The time Ace Team used between releases has been used wisely. Playing through the game, you can feel how the studio has improved both creatively and technically. That's not to say that the game is perfect though, it's still kinda rough in some areas and could definitely use some much needed touch-ups. In my eyes, however, the good vastly outweighs the rougher areas of the game. You seriously gotta play it, like right now. Just leave my video playing in the background. Xenoclash at its heart is a beat 'em up, but not like any of the ones you're thinking of. It's more like throwing hands with the Fent Fiends outside of an interdimensional 7-Eleven. The newest entry in the series still champions that feeling in gameplay, but with some much needed updates. You can really feel the influence of more recent popular action games in Clash, mainly that of the new God of War games and also Dark Souls. I was a little wary when I realized this in my first playthrough, as so much of why I enjoyed the Xenoclash games was its strange uniqueness. My ass was worried for nothing. Ace Team pulls through and knocks it out of the park. The game's identity shines through all the new additions. For starters, the camera backed that thing up into third-person perspective. We now have a much easier time surveying our surroundings and keeping track of multiple enemies than we did in the first. This also means that the game is much better to play with a controller. There's a lot of beautiful, strange things in Clash, but one of them isn't the controls. That shit is just strange, in a really annoying way. I mean, for the most part, the game controls are just fine. Everything is responsive and quick, and it works for like 90% of the game. But then the other 5%, you're wondering why there's no dedicated button map for switching weapons, or why the upgrade menus don't immediately allow you to start upgrading. You gotta show up to the DMV with your social security number and birth certificate before you can assign any skill points. While the upgrade menus aren't a huge part of the game, it would still go a long way if some of the UI was just ironed out a bit more. But nobody's playing this game for the menu design. You're here for the pure, unadulterated violence that this series is known for, and by God does it deliver. Ace Team knew where to focus their efforts, and as a result, Clash has the best feeling combat out of any of the games in the series. Things still feel as chaotic and brutal as ever, but there is a tangible sense that our character and our moveset is so much more refined, with dodging and parrying similar to what you would find in a Souls game. Fighting feels more like a deadly rhythmic dance than an all-out brawl. And don't get me wrong, I still love the combat in the first 2 games. It will never not feel good to wildly clobber characters that look like computer science majors. But in Clash: Artifacts of Chaos, we feel more like a trained martial artist and a skilled fighter. Part of this feeling also comes from the fact that you can now switch fighting stances during fights. You could think of these stances kind of like weapons in a FromSoft game. They change how fast or slowly you play and can be upgraded through items you find throughout the world. During fights where you're juggling multiple combatants at once, switching stances is crucial for dealing with certain enemies effectively. Different stances work better for different foes, so you gotta be stanced up appropriately to not get your shit rocked. There are different weapons that you can use, although sadly the projectile weapons from the first Xenoclash are absent. It's unfortunate. You gotta keep that motherfucking thing on you in Xenozoic, whatever that thing even is. The weapons are useful for some fights, but they never feel as satisfying as just using your fists. I gotta get one of my biggest gripes with the game out of the way early. Clash is janky, like to the point where I was glitching into walls during fights multiple times. This feels all the more frustrating because of how awesome the combat is. Having your flow interrupted because you're clipping on some random piece of terrain feels insanely frustrating. Nothing's better than almost KOing a dude, only to clip into a wall like a Gmod character. I'm hesitating on calling this game a Souls-like, although you could definitely make a strong argument that it is. The combat feels similar enough, especially with how much more difficult it is compared to the previous entries. I had to lock in for almost every fight, and I was only playing on normal difficulty. It's still extremely satisfying though. But there are a multitude of mechanics in Clash that will feel super familiar to Souls players. Yeah, I'm looking at you with your intelligence build. Disgusting. For example, we have a limited amount of healing that we can take into fights. This healing can also be refilled at various checkpoints throughout the map. Although refills aren't exactly free, you gotta brew your own health potions with materials you find around the map. Mixing different ingredients together could give you added buffs along with healing. There's definitely a way to tell what buffs you'll get from what ingredients, but I always thought it more lore accurate to just throw a bunch of random gross shit into a cauldron and hope for the best. We can also find a major similarity in the design and layout of each level. Every area has multiple routes that can loop back into earlier portions of the area, or open shortcuts to completely different locations on the map. While you do have objectives to complete throughout the game, you'll never be pointed in any specific direction. You just gotta explore around and find out for yourself. There is an added layer of depth to this exploration though, as certain areas of the map are only accessible at night. When you die or sleep until night at your camp, you can control a puppet version of the main character. This allows you to fight different enemies that spawn at night, but also allow you to walk through the thorn bushes that block your path during the day. Ace Team pulled off the level design expertly in my opinion, as finding these shortcuts feels just as satisfying as they do in the game that inspired it. One of my favorite things Clash does though is something completely unique to itself, that being the ritual. For context, the setting of these games is a lawless hellscape called Toronto. I mean Xenozoic. Here there is only one law. If you are challenged to the ritual, you must participate. The ritual is a game of chance that will determine whether or not you'll have an advantage or disadvantage in the upcoming fight. For example, if my opponent plays the tether artifact, I'll be tethered to one spot in the fight if he wins. But if I play the snake poison artifact, he will be slowly poisoned during the fight. Even though I got my ass handed to me most of the time during the ritual, I still felt that it was an awesome mechanic and added a ton of variety to the combat. In one instance, I used an artifact that would allow me to summon my opponent for a future fight if I beat him. And my opponent was this behemoth enemy that looked like Hurley from Lost. Sure enough though, I beat him and was able to summon him again in a later fight. Stuff like this is what makes this game such a unique and memorable experience. I really wish more devs had the creative chops of Ace Team. Speaking of creativity, look at this fucking game, dude. If you watch my first Xenoclash video, you'll know that I had to gush about how much I loved the setting of the game. And surprise, surprise, I'm gonna do the same thing in this video, because Clash deserves it. The land of Xenozoic is a character unto itself. Every area of the game is drenched in this mysterious and deadly atmosphere. Xenozoic is not a hospitable place in the slightest, but there's now a sense of stylized beauty to the world that wasn't present in the previous games. Each area is now coated in super vibrant and saturated colors that make the world feel like a living entity, an entity that wants to spill your brains all over the floor. Every enemy in this game is a gross freak in their own special way, and I love every single one of them, especially the lions that look like Brexit geezers. Whoever came up with these designs needs sloppy toppy under their desk immediately. I expected to be pleased with how the game looked, but one thing that caught me completely off guard was the game's story. If you're coming into Artifacts of Chaos expecting the story to pick up where Xenoclash left off, you might be a little disappointed. I kinda was at first. I want to know what my slime gad is getting up to. It would appear that AOC is possibly a reboot of the series' story, or at least something entirely new. My disappointment was incredibly short-lived, however. The voice acting and writing in this game is on an entirely different level than the first two games. The improvement is night and day. Like I said earlier, the game seems to be heavily inspired by the newer God of War games. The narrative uses the tried and true formula of a grumpy old badass who's gotta protect a small innocent kid. You could say this sort of story is kinda getting played out, but I don't mind it personally. I'll always have a soft spot in my heart for these types of stories. The grumpy old dude we play as is Pseudo. He's like Clint Eastwood if he was whatever the hell this thing is.
I don't have any dice. Then I've already won. I get to hit you first. One of those sentences is true.
Look at those grippers, Jesus. Our quest begins with Pseudo finding this little ball of feathers who I think is literally just called Boy. Boy just watched his grandpa get beat to death and now has nobody to take care of him. Pseudo reluctantly agrees to travel along with the boy until he finds a suitable home. This was a bald-faced lie though. Pseudo was actually hired to deliver the boy to the local gang lord Gemini, who believes the boy has special powers that could heal her. And he does. His ability allows him to link two entities together, which can be used to heal if he wants to. Pseudo is a softy at heart it seems, and backs out of the deal last second to protect the boy from whatever Gemini is planning. So now there's a bounty on your head, and you gotta defend yourself from every freaking Xenozoic who wants to take you on. Like I said earlier, the main draw of the game's story for me is the voice acting on display, especially from Pseudo and the boy. Both of their actors did an incredible job, and the conversations that the two of them have comes off as extremely natural.
Pseudo, when you were small, did you have feathers?
No.
Why not?
Why would I have feathers?
Because they're soft, and you're so bald.
Hey, you little cack, I was born this way.
You said cack.
We also get some really stellar world building and storytelling throughout the game. You wouldn't expect a game where the characters look like this to dive into things like philosophy and human nature. One thing that I failed to mention in my last Xenoclash video was that the land of Cenozoic isn't the entire world. There's actually an entire other civilization present who have access to extremely advanced technology, and deliberately keep the people of Xenozoic in the Stone Age, perpetually fueling the cycle of chaos and violence seen everywhere in the game. But we learn that this other civilization is also crumbling from the opposite problem. They're drowning in all the laws and rules that they made. Good thing that's not relevant in any way in real life. So there's this really interesting moral dilemma dealing with the nature of laws and the battle between order and anarchy. But in order to talk about how the story gets really good, I gotta talk about some spoilers. If you haven't played the game yet, skip here to avoid having the story get ruined for you. So, it's alluded that Pseudo trained under an extremely powerful master, but who that master was is unknown. When the boy gets sick and we gotta go find a way to help him, we run into Pseudo's old master, and it's Golem from the original Xenoclash. We learn that the boy's abilities were actually a product of people from the outside civilization. Pseudo is pretty pissed about this news and tries to fight Golem. Golem doesn't really have time for this horse hockey and just gives Pseudo an artifact that will help him defeat Gemini. After beating the snot out of Gemini, Pseudo and the boy settle down and live happily ever after. Nah, just kidding. Nothing good ever happens in Xenozoic. The boy is taken by Golem in the middle of the night to a huge ship that will take him away to the outside world. Pseudo fights desperately to keep the boy, but we all know it's futile. Golem calls out Pseudo for being selfish, knowing fully well that he just wants to not feel alone anymore. Looking after the boy gave his life purpose, and he's not ready to give that up. Eventually, after Pseudo no longer has the strength to fight, the boy comes to him and tells him he has to let go. The boy explains that both the Xenozoic and the outside world are falling apart, and that for both of them to survive, he needs to go off with Golem and at least try to help. The boy says that he and Pseudo will always be linked, no matter what. After that, we watch them depart, leaving Pseudo alone once again. Full transparency, I cried like a bitch here. I was so not ready for the emotional gut punch that the game was hiding the entire time. Maybe I'm just too attached to the franchise and I like the world way too much. But this game's story is way better than I was expecting. Even if you're not super interested in the world of Xenoclash like me, I think there's a story here that hits incredibly hard. I am praying to any deity that will hear me, please don't let this be the last we see of this franchise. There are only a few other studios in the world of game development that are on the same level of creativity as Ace Team. Out of all the games I've yapped about on my channel, I hope you decide to support Clash. This series should be way more well known than it is, and I want as many people to realize that as possible. I know 2024 is already looking stacked when it comes to game releases, but if you have the time, give Clash a chance. You really won't regret it. In the meantime, I'm moving to Xenozoic. I gotta figure out what combination of frogs and moths I gotta mix up to make a lean.
This food is so fucking good, Lois. Ah, okay. Wow.